I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. And again, I'm so grateful that you can join me today. Today is going to be a special episode, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. It's going to be very much about this podcast and about the people we have on it, why we have people on it, and mainly the themes that we choose to follow. For me, one of the great joys of this podcast is that I get to connect with people who have gone through, and it's very sad, but people who have gone through some of the harshest, often most difficult moments of life. And yet at the same time, they have displayed incredible resilience, strength, and often incredible hope. That is why we do this podcast, to tell those stories. And this year we tried something new, and we introduced themes for very few episodes, and we've gone through themes like solitude, being alone, forgiveness, forgiving people who have done the worst things to you, and also rebirth, when you have to start a new life and start again. And we spoke to incredible guests for each and every one of those. And many of them had stories that really embody what the foundation of what we think this podcast should be. And that is resilience, the ability to get through the worst of life and do it with your shoulders held high. And so look, today we're going to go back and we're going to revisit some of those conversations, some of those guests, and I hope try and introduce you to some of the stories that we hope this podcast will convey. Firstly, we want to introduce to you a guest called Steve Callahan, an amazing man who joined us for our solitude theme. This is a man who survived about 2.5 months at sea. 2.5 months. Steve was out there by himself, alone, in a tiny little raft. And he found a way through it, both physically and mentally. And he talked to me openly about what it was like, the highs and the lows, and he shared with me how he managed to endure that time. You've said that you were amazed to find how much resilience you actually had. You know, most people don't know how much resilience they have until they really need it, until their back is against the wall. But you found that. What is that moment?
Part of it is from achievement. You know, I've talked about hope to people. I don't think hope is just wishful thinking. You don't like sit back and just go, oh yeah, I hope my life is going to have meaning. It's not like that. Hope is something you build step by step. And I think my entire life history played into it, as it does for all of us. That, you know, I had often faced challenges, and they're not easy all the time to face these challenges. But when you get through them, it's like, oh, that's a great reward. I had taken offshore shorthanded trips where let's say doing races offshore. Where I didn't win the race, but I instead, let's say the rudder fell off the boat and I was able to effect a repair, some kind of a jury rig that would work, and got myself to the other end and then finished mid-fleet. I mean, that to me was a huge, huge success, you know, that we can find these rewards from taking small achievable steps. In the life raft, that was things like getting a solar still to work that, as far as I know, to this date, these were produced during the Second World War, but could not be used as directed. And I had incredible trouble getting them to work at all, and ended up being challenged by them basically every day, but they produced just enough water for me to survive. So that was a huge success. When I holed the bottom of the raft on the 43rd day, which just about did kill me, where I came very close to that line of acceptance that, no, this is the end of the line. After 10 days, I think it was about 10 days of struggling to fix this critical problem.
It was the fork.
Yeah, I handled to a fork ended up being the solution. But, you know, in the end, I mean, I often reference, movies. I'm a big movie buff. And Castaway has this brilliant scene, which Joe Ween, who made this documentary, incorporates in it, where I describe this, which is, you know, I'm right on the edge of death. I've tried everything I could possibly figure out. I have no backup in terms of somebody else's opinion who probably could have solved the problem in 15 minutes. And in the end, just this forcing myself right at that critical moment where really I was not going to have much of a choice anymore. I figured I had one more shot at it, and I went through all of the gear that I had and so on, and finally stumbled on this idea of how to fix it. And when I fixed it, honestly, it was like I was king of the world. It's like when Tom Hanks is going around the fire going, look at me, and that kind of a high was about the biggest high of my life, even though it's a simple little thing.
Would that then have been followed afterwards by a big low? Like, do you suddenly get the endorphins that lift you up, and then you realize you are back where you are? You're still in the middle of the ocean. You're still just floating around. So, I'm sure you're familiar with this, or I imagine you are. Maybe your experience is quite different, but I often talk about survival is normal life just on steroids, as we like to say. That we all go through periods of ups and downs, highs and lows, but in a crisis situation, the lows tend to be incredibly low, and the highs tend to be incredibly high, and they're often like really compressed, where you can be 1 minute on the edge of like wanting to just say, I'm done, I'm getting out of the raft and swimming away from this or whatever, and the next you're the king of the world. It's really quite an amazing up and down experience. I also spoke with Scarlett Lewis, and this is a very tricky conversation, and it was a difficult conversation because she is the mother of a 6-year-old, Jessie, and Jessie died in the Sandy Hook school shooting. And I think that is a story that hit each and every one of us. And I'm a father, and many of you will be parents. So to understand and to listen, to tell the story of the mother who went through that, I think is really deep. And yet she forgave the person who carried out that shooting. And I think that is just a remarkable story, and that's why we had her on the podcast. And so Scarlett joined us for our forgiveness theme, and was frankly remarkable. It's interesting because I get asked all the time, and I know that totally different circumstances, but what it's like. I've been covering wars and conflict for 18 odd years, and everyone says, how difficult, how tragic, and I often say yes, but you'd be amazed at how much bravery and kindness and courage and family ties you see out there. And it always takes people by surprise, but sometimes you do see some remarkable things in the most difficult, horrible places. How do you, though, you said that you were like this, you've always lived your life like that, but how do you kind of train and teach the next generation to feel that or to embrace that?
Yeah, well, so I'm actually sitting in front of, in my background is our Choose Love formula. And this came from a message that I found shortly after Jesse's murder that he had left on our kitchen chalkboard. 3 words, phonetically spelled, because remember, he was a first grader, just learning how to write. And those 3 words were nurturing, healing, love. And I saw those, and I literally had a lightning bolt go through me. And I thought, that's the solution right there. That's the message that would have prevented all of this. And by the way, Benjamin, maybe even what happened to you. So I just realized I'm going to be spreading this message. So from Jesse's example of courage, we found out within days of the tragedy that he had literally sacrificed his life to save 9 of his classmates, and his message of nurturing, healing, love. We put together this formula, and we teach kids to have the courage to face pain. We give them a different perspective of pain, rather than how it can harm us. And by the way, that's how our brain focuses. We teach kids that pain has a purpose, that even though, you can't always choose what happens to you in life, you can take your personal power back in how you choose to thoughtfully respond. And choosing love is this thoughtful response from our prefrontal cortex, not our fear center. So we teach them to have the courage to face difficulty, conflict, and get curious, to pause literally in between Viktor Frankl's famous quote, in between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose. And as human beings, our choice is our superpower. We can choose from moment to moment how we thoughtfully respond. We tell them that. So we say, pause when something happens and get curious about what the gifts are, about how you can learn from this, how you can grow from it, how you can be strengthened. There's something in everything for you. And then the formula goes on into gratitude, having the courage to be grateful even when things aren't going your way. We know from research that literally fortifies us from the inside out to better be able to handle adversity, whatever it is, with more strength and grace. And then we teach forgiveness. Forgiveness is probably the number one most powerful thing that I did in my own personal healing. And so many people, you talked about how kids aren't afraid. Well, it's so funny because a lot of adults don't understand what forgiveness is. They think that it means that whatever happened that hurt them is okay, that they're supposed to forget it, that they can't hold anybody accountable. And absolutely not. It simply means that you let the pain go. You harvest the gifts, whatever it is, the meaning, the purpose of whatever happened, and then you let go of the pain. And then compassion in action is identifying a need within ourselves or somebody else and actively doing something to help ease that suffering. And by the way, when we do that, we help and heal ourselves. That is choosing love in a nutshell. That's what we teach kids. We teach them about post-traumatic growth. And by the way, most people haven't heard of it. And that is the way that we are created as human beings. That is to grow through pain. We all want and need love, but we know we're going to have pain as human beings, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And a lot of times we just spend most of our time resisting or avoiding pain or numbing ourselves, when in reality, that pain gets us out of our comfort zone into our growth zone. And that's where we find the best version of ourselves. That's where we find the best version of other people too, as you were saying, Benjamin.
But so if the question was, no one is born with that sort of hatred or evil inside them, then there must have been an understanding that perhaps the parenting or the education, at some point, something needed to be fixed. And you must have gone back and said, and I've seen the amazing work you've done since, it must have been about looking for where did that happen and how can we address it? And where do you think that really began? And then how are you now trying to change that?
Well, I got up at Jesse's funeral and I said to the congregation, because everybody had been asking me, what can we do? And I said, there is something that you can all do. I said, this whole tragedy started with an angry thought in Adam Lanza's head. And I pictured him as a little boy having an angry thought without the skills, tools, or nurturing environment to be able to manage that thought. That thought, along with pain, along with bullying, along with neglect, along with most likely abuse, turned into the Sandy Hook tragedy. And I said to the congregation, amazingly, a thought can be changed. So I asked everybody to start thinking about what they think about and to change one angry thought into a loving thought every day. I said, loving, kind, compassionate thoughts, they feel good, and that is reflected in our behavior. Angry, hateful, resentful thoughts, they feel bad. This is the cognitive triangle. And that's how we show up in our relationships. So everyone went out really to the four corners of the United States. They start calling me, texting me, emailing me within a week, saying that one simple act had completely changed their lives. So I knew that I was onto something.
You're listening to Searching for Heroes. We'll be right back after this. Next up, I would like to introduce former mobster Michael Franzese. Michael left the mob, turned his back on it, founded a new life. And I think that's such a message to each and every one of us. The ability to leave something that is difficult and yet find something new, a new path. That's something I hope this podcast does. leave something bad, find something new, find a path forward. So again, he was just another great, great guest, and I'm so pleased he was on. That moment you decided you want to turn your life around, was that a sudden decision that you realized, or was that something that grew throughout your time in the mob? You started to think you wanted to change, or did it happen suddenly?
Well, it's kind of a complex answer on that, because sometimes I even question myself, when did this really start? But there were things that I saw in that life, and quite honestly, things that I did that I wasn't comfortable with doing. And the problem with me personally is that I did them anyway, because I had taken an oath and that was my life and I was in it all the way. But it was very troubling. But I never had the thought of walking away from that life until, quite honestly, I met this young girl who's now my wife of 40 years. What I've said afterwards, and this is not something I thought about when I was in the life, but I looked at it and I said, it's an evil lifestyle. And the reason I say that, I'm not calling the guys evil. I was one of them. And, there's an age-old question. Why do good people do bad things sometimes? There's a lot of reasons for that. Doesn't necessarily make them a bad or an evil person inside. And, I don't want to get into all of that. But, every family of every member of that life that I know of has been devastated, including my own. Now, not my wife and kids, but my father did 40 years in prison. My mother was 33 years without her husband. When she passed away in 2012, I can only describe her life with my dad as being ugly, because she blamed him for everything that went wrong in her life, and rightfully so. And what went wrong? My sister, 27 years old, dies of an overdose of drugs. My brother, 25 years a drug addict. I can't even begin to tell you just what I had to do to try to keep him alive on the street. My younger sister, 40 years old, was never mentally stable with all the turbulence in our household. She passed away at the age of 41, and the whole family was destroyed. And so many families of members of that life meet the same fate. So I said, I met this young girl. Am I going to put her through the same thing? I'm in love with her. Is it right for her? She's 20 years old. And I started thinking at that point, man, that I had to disassociate myself with that life. But, I wasn't willing. I didn't want to cooperate with the government. I didn't want to start putting people in jail. It was a very, very tough time, because you don't just publicly walk away from that life. I didn't want to go into hiding or anything like that, because it would have shown that I was doing something wrong. So it was a tough decision and a tough execution of that decision, I have to say.
And yet everyone who has sort of been in the mob, they must have experienced the same things. They must see people losing their lives. They must see the impact. And yet not many people make that decision. And so curious as to, A, why many people don't leave. Do they just not see anything positive on the other side? Is it because they are so deep in, that's the only thing they know? But you did. You found that courage. And so you really are one of very, very few people who have done it. So again, everyone sees what it's like in the mob when you're in the mob, and yet you change. So what's the difference between you and the people who don't leave?
Well, I think it's indoctrination. You get so much a part of that life. I'll be honest with you. I would wake up leaving the life, go to sleep, staying in the life, because you feel like you take an oath and you have this brotherhood around you. And how could you ever betray your oath? And for me, it was even harder because I grew up in that life. My dad was a major figure in that life. He was the underboss of the Colombo family. So I had that influence from childhood. So it was very difficult. And I think that's what happens with most guys. And then, listen, it's a little bit intoxicating. You get the power, you get the, this feeling like when I came into the life, they said, Mike, wherever you go in the world, don't worry. You have your brothers going to be there for you. Don't ever worry about your mother, your sister, your daughter, your wife. We'll take care of you. And of course, a lot of that is not true, because a mob, like anything else, like any other organization, it gets corrupted. And, so it's very, very hard for some people to make that break because they don't know anything else. This is who they are. This is what they've been. And the only time they seem to make that break is if it's self-preservation, if they're going to jail forever and they have to cooperate with the government and, save themselves in that way.
Finally, we spoke with Darren Edwards. This was a guy who fell 100 feet. He plummeted through the air while he was climbing, and he managed barely to survive. And that was because of the heroic act that was carried out by his best friend, a best friend who was there to save his life. And yet he was critically injured, an injury that changed his life forever. And yet he's a remarkable man. He's someone who right now is sit skiing to the South Pole. So a recent guest, but someone who inspired me in many ways because he was injured in a way that perhaps I was injured, the inability to walk for a while. So again, I hope that that can inspire you as well. First of all, there was what happened on that day and what happened when you were paralyzed. But there was also a moment when during your recovery where you were at rock bottom. And it was something that your physio said to you. And I think this is so important that really pulled you together and pulled you through. What was happening at that time?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, as I'm sure you can, you understand and like sometimes the toughest battles are the mental ones. The physical scars tend to heal quicker than the psychological ones. And for me, I'm 4.5 months into my rehab, 4.5 months after my life changed. And the last thing I expected was for my relationship, with the woman that, as far as I was concerned, in a way I was going to spend the rest of my life with. And 4.5 months later, that person comes in and says, I can't do it. I love you, but I don't think I love you enough to stand next to you for these next few years and for the journey. I'm really sorry. And as I'm sure you can imagine, like that absolutely broke my heart. And that was the real rock bottom. And that was the start of a very difficult period for me in terms of my mental health and my reason for being. I felt like I'd lost a massive part of who I was in my loss of mountaineering and climbing, but also then a loss of a relationship. And it was my physio, Kate, who in the weeks that followed kind of came up to me and just said, look, I know there's nothing I can say that is going to flick that switch in your brain, and it's not going to hurt. But if there's one thing that you could do for me, it's to not focus on how you feel and how much it hurts, but to focus on the man that you want to become. And she just said to me, look, think about who you are 4 years from now, what Darren Edwards has gone on to achieve, what he stands for. And when you've got that image in your head, retrace his steps to right here, right now, this conversation with me, feeling bruised and battered by the events of life. And, when you've got that image, just take tiny steps towards who you want to become. And that advice helped me to reframe the way I looked at adversity and the way I looked at that loss of a relationship and loss of identity, because all of a sudden I had something to work towards.
Yeah. I wonder if sort of your partner was also one of the most motivating things for you, that you wanted to get better for her too. And so the loss of that relationship almost felt like the loss of one of your great motivations at that point. Yeah,
I completely agree. Yeah, no, entirely. I think I wanted to show her that I could overcome and I could adapt and I could learn and I could grow. And in my head, we were going to be that couple, the couple that others walked past on top of a hill and kind of went, wow, look at those two. He's in a wheelchair. She doesn't care. They're at the top of a hill, loving life. And that was the image I had in my head of a year from now, 2 years from now, 4 years from now. So suddenly to lose that motivator and to lose that image that you'd so kind of like persistently work towards in those really difficult weeks and months in the aftermath of my accident. Yeah, that really hurt. That was my rock bottom. And that's where, people like Kate come forward in life and save you. Yeah. And she saved me.
So look, I hope you really enjoyed this episode of the podcast. It is the end of the year. And I think as we all head into the new year, it is a moment to reflect on what makes us strong. And I hope that the stories of my guests give you a bit of strength. Perhaps a reminder that no matter how difficult your life is, no matter how traumatic things are in front of you, you can find a way through. And I hope that's why you come back to the podcast. And look, in the new year, we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep telling stories of amazing people. And I hope you'll keep joining us. So thank you again. Thanks for being a part of this. And thank you. God bless and keep going. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts. And Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.